Okay, we're back after some coffee and restrooms. So, the last period we talked about was the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, again, was a classical age of harmony. At least that's what they hoped for, right? And they aimed for. They didn't always have it, like all of these ages. Speaking of all of these ages, I'd just like to emphasize the idea that we are all of these times, right? We say, okay, the Renaissance is over, the Middle Ages are over. But at various times in our lives, we are various periods, so to speak. We have various senses of reality. For example, a lot of people, as they get older in their 70s and 80s, think a lot more about the beyond, right? They think much more in terms of the Middle Ages. They become, in some ways, a little bit more medieval, because they at least very much wonder about what, if anything, is beyond all this, right? And that wonder, that sense of looking beyond this world, because this world is for a 95-year-old, let's say, no longer the focus of their lives, the main focus, is really a medieval idea. So in all of these ways, we, at various times, become various time periods. So just for the sake of reminding us that it makes sense to go back in time and look at how did the Renaissance think about harmony in life, because there are times when we think about harmony in life. It makes sense to go back to the Baroque period and think about what they're dealing with, because we deal with that too. And now let's go on to the Baroque. After this Renaissance harmony, some things started coming into the world, mainly ideas, that threw the harmony off in a rather that's what Sheboygan is, in a rather radical way. Rather radical way. Try that 15 times. And that is, started arguably with science, right? We were pretty content in the Renaissance with the idea that the spiritual world and the physical world are all hand in hand. That is to say, the laws of nature, there are no such things, they believed in them, but they were in God's hand, let's say. The spiritual and the physical were one, or at least in harmony. Now, what Galileo came up with didn't exactly disprove that, but it threw people's certainty off. It threw them off balance, so to speak. What Galileo discovered, among other things, was that when you look up into the heavens, that the other planets are made of the same stuff as this one is. We kind of considered ourselves in this central important place in the middle of God's universe, and now all of a sudden we're just like everything else out there, or a lot of other that stuff out there, which is a little disconcerting because it makes us feel a little bit more insignificant, right? So what is this wonderful balance? Is it still there between God and human beings if we're just on this little speck? The other thing he discovered, of course, is that the Earth is not the center of the galaxy, of the solar system, but the sun is, which makes us one of, at that time, 8, I guess, or was it less than that, planets spinning around, which makes us even more insignificant. So this notion of the central placement of human beings in a divinely ordained world gets thrown off a little bit, right? And then the other thing is this sense of motion, the movement of the Earth, that we are spinning wildly, first of all this way, and secondly this way around the sun, is really weird if you haven't thought about that before, right? And so all of a sudden, we become aware of the fact that we are in a universe that is in this almost insane motion, constant spinning and twirling and orbiting. And that's strange. It's exciting. The Baroque was an exciting age for all kinds of reasons, as we're going to see. But it's also disconcerting. And it throws off our certainty about where we are in God's world, right? Does it make sense? Mm-hmm. So now we're looking at, instead of a harmony of opposites, the divine, let's say, and the physical, we're looking at, it's not even so much, you could call it a contradiction. It is that. But more than even a contradiction, it's just a question mark. I was just going to put a question mark on the board, which is really dumb now that I think about it, so I'm not going to do that. Right? So in the Baroque period, people say, so what is the relationship between the spiritual dimension, what we in Christianity call heaven, and in every religion has something like this, and what we call earth, or the physical? What is the dimension, what is the relationship, for example, if you look down the page here, of the antitheses. Antitheses means things that seem to contradict each other. Anti, right? Thesis. What is the relationship between this feeling of motion that is everywhere, apparently, and Newton discovered, for example, the same laws of motion dictate the blood that goes through our bloodstream. And ideas themselves are in constant motion now because everybody's coming up with new ideas. Does this make sense? And so how do I find order? How do I find constancy? How do I find a meaning that stays there, right? Is everything constantly moving around? Does that mean that meaning in life is constantly in flux and I can't hold on to anything anymore? And they even began to think about their own personalities, right? What's the difference between you sitting here in this room and you when you were 6 months old? Well, it's gigantic, right? So what keeps us the same? The cells in our body have all regenerated by now. Our minds are totally different. We barely knew anything at 6 months. But something about us is constant. But what the hell is it, to use the French, right? Right? That's the Baroque question. And not only that, not only these physical attributes, now I go to the next page, but it's also the sense of authority. And that was maybe even the scariest of all. Who do we look to, or what do we look to, for a sense of what things mean? Even in the Renaissance, we look to the church for ultimate meaning. What is God? Well, the church told us, because we, of course, were merely human, but the priests were somehow a little bit more initiated into the mystery that is the divine. Well, along comes Martin Luther about 100 years ago, before the Renaissance, before the Baroque period, and says, no, actually every human being has the capacity to think, believe, and understand as well as any other human being. It's a kind of democracy of understanding God, so to speak. He called it the priesthood of all believers. So it's not the priest that knows and we who get the information, and even though we don't understand it, we just believe it. That was the old method. Now we're stuck with the idea that we have to make sense of it. That's scary. Now that old sense of authority that used to be the church, it's not exactly gone, but it sure is called into question. I like to think of the Baroque period as adolescence. We all do it, right? When we're 14, 15, 16 years old, we're suddenly getting smarter. We're really starting to be able to look at the world and understand it for ourselves. It used to be that we said, why, to our parents, why, and they explained it to us. And we just took it. Even if they didn't know what they were talking about, we believed it, right? So there was a sort of unthinking authority there in the parents. When you get to be 14, 15, 16, you begin to understand things on your own. You're not real good at it yet, as they weren't, right? But it has a couple of reactions. And what are the main emotional reactions that a 13, 14, 15-year-old person has? Do you remember what it was like to be 14? It's different for various people, but you're going to see it all in the Baroque period. It's all there. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say probably, you think you know everything.
Yeah.
You can't do wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and there's a lot of that in the Baroque period, a sort of exaggerated certainty. Like the church went back and said, no, Galileo, and they didn't think he was exactly wrong. They just said, we don't care what you found. It's not important, and they locked him up. They put him under house arrest. Right? The Inquisition. And the Inquisition was saying, yeah, you're right, exactly. Damn it, here I stand. This is truth, and I don't care what you found right over there. It's not important, right? So there's a strange class. So yeah, so obstinacy, right? So exaggerated certainty to make up for the uncertainty that's really in there. Yeah. So, and then there's also a little anger, and we always get angry at our parents when when we start thinking that we're smarter than or they're not quite as smart as we thought they were, and we're a little smarter than we thought we were, but they're not quite dumb enough to be, and we're not quite smart enough, and that's really annoying, and it's, and there's a lot of that. Caravaggio, the guy that painted that piece that we're going to look at, was famous for killing a guy on a tennis court. Maybe that's just coincidence. And we'll come back to that later. So we're stuck between faith and reason, as a 16-year-old and in the Baroque period. Still with me? Okay. So are we looking for truth from an authority figure, or are we finding it ourselves? That's a 16-year-old, 15-year-old's dilemma. It's also the dilemma of the Baroque Age. Are we asking the king for our social understanding? Or are we creating a democracy like what Cromwell tried to do in England at this time with a revolution, also an angry approach to the reality? Are we trying to figure out, like Luther said, God through our own conscience and our own sensibility? Or are we looking to the priest and saying, tell me what it means? And we sort of sense both of these are somehow right, but we can't make them fit together. So the Baroque Age is an age of antitheses. It's an age of opposites that can't seem to come together, right? And as an age, we don't pick one and discard the other the way the Middle Ages did, or the way the Romans did. We got them both hand in hand. On the left hand, we've got the physical world. On the right hand, we've got the spiritual world. In the left hand, we have reason. In the right hand, we've got emotion. In the left hand, we have the authorities that were handed down to us. On the right hand, we've got our own feelings and our own newfound intelligence and investigative powers. Right? And we don't know how to put them together. We just are lost. And that sense of excitement and frustration is the Baroque. This sort of being lost. Another part about rediscovering the physical world, we all did that already in the Renaissance, but now it's becoming an issue, is eroticism. It was one of the most sexual, erotic time periods. There's an altar in, where is it? Somewhere in Italy, I believe, that has an angel stabbing St. Teresa in the heart. She had these visions. And the description of it and the expression of it is absolutely erotic. It's very weird. To put that on an altarpiece in a church, you could get away with that in Pennsylvania. Right? But in the Baroque period, there was no question that sexuality was also somehow divine. But God knows, so to speak, how. Right? The question mark was still there. Nobody knew what happened to Teresa, whether it was true, whether it was false. But it was very clearly like an erotic experience, like a sexual experience when she had a vision of the divine and she knew what God wanted her to do. Very weird. Read those memoirs sometime, but put them in a brown paper bag when you take them home. And so in other words, all these strange contradictions and confrontations. I think you can look over these things. I think that gives us a pretty good sense of where the Baroque is coming from, or what it's searching for. I was trying to figure out. One of the most important ideas of the Baroque for music now is going to be this sense of confrontation or antithesis, one thing up against another. And another is this sense of motion, of constant motion that Galileo and Newton discovered, and trying to find a hold, a sense of structure, a sense of order in this motion. And that includes not only the physical motion of the world around us, but also the movement of ideas, this constantly changing time. Things were changing very fast. I don't know if you know that feeling, if you were around in the 60s. You had the feeling that in the 1960s, every 2 years, it was a totally different world. And you get to the 70s, and all of a sudden, nothing happened. It's just, pretty much the same thing. The United States was changing incredibly fast in the 60s, and it wasn't changing fast at all in the 70s and 80s. For all sorts of reasons, I don't know, but that feeling must have been the Baroque, is this 60s feeling, is that everything is moving really, really fast. But not just socially, so in the entire world. Okay, let's take a break here for a while I set up the rest.